All right. Okay. Hi, everyone. I've not introduced myself yet, but I am the secretary of the ANU HiSoc team. Thank you for taking your time to join us for Track 3 Innovating Better Technology to Prevent or Minimize Infection workshop. I just have a quick admin note for you. After this workshop, we highly encourage you to reconvene on Remo's 4th floor, and this is designated specifically for Track 3 teams. If you do have a smaller team than you started out with, we encourage you to merge with other teams who still have keen participants, but who are also a bit smaller. And to all those who are still interested but couldn't make this workshop, just to let you know that everything is recorded and placed on YouTube for your convenience, and to still keep in contact with your other team members. Alrighty. So Track 3 workshop will be coordinated with the help of Dr. Nicolo Malagutti. I hope I said that right.
It's Malagutti, but that's fine.
Malagutti, okay. Thank you for the correction. Dr. Malagutti is a biomedical engineer and lecturer at RSSE EMEANU. His current research interests include medical device development and modeling of biomedical systems. He has industry experience in a variety of technical and clinical research and development settings. Dr. Malagutti will be speaking in depth about how COVID-19 is a multi-layered problem that requires a multi-layered response, and will be addressing the current challenges that we face during this pandemic. Okay.
Thank you so much, Sabia. Just before I start, I'll just go and share my screen. I wanted to let people know this class, 9 people plus Sabia. So if you guys want to in your homes, but my plan was to try and make a little bit of a presentation, but also a chat. And so if you want to turn your videos on at any point in time, I like to see people's faces, and then I know if I am boring people or if I'm actually saying something that is of your liking at any point in time. Can I just get, and you don't want to talk, you want to show yourself, it's also fine. I'm used to being a bit of a mixed bag. If you want to drop something in the chat at any point in time, please do so, and I will stop and I will address what you are asking. But absolutely, just get yourself and jump in, raise your hand. You know, I'll try and follow all that as well. So if you know that someone is agitating in some way and I'm not paying attention, please help me focus my attention. All right, everybody. So no one is verified that they can see my screen. Can I get a yay from somebody?
Oh, I could see your screen.
Okay, I saw a thumbs up from one of the people who have their camera on, so that's perfect.
Your audio was a little jagged before, so you might need to repeat the past like 2 minutes of what you just said, because your audio was cutting in and out. Sorry.
Let me check then before I go any further that I am on the right. I've got 2 Wi-Fi networks in my place, and so I just want to make sure that I'm on the right one. Just 1 second. Yeah, I am on the right one. So hopefully this was just a training thing. Wobbles, you know, again. Okay, so I'm sharing that, and here it is. All right, sorry. All right, I'll make a start. This is track 3, innovating better technology to prevent and minimize infection. So welcome to all of you. And Sabia has introduced me already. So I am a biomedical engineer and lecturer. I teach at the Research School of Engineering, used to be called. Now it's got a very long name, RSEEME, but it is the ANU Engineering School. Yeah, so amongst the things I do is I've done a bunch of system modeling in different sort of aspects of biomedical applications, and in general, I'm a big promoter of systems thinking in solving medical problems of various scales, and we'll talk about how COVID actually is a very massive, intricate scale sort of systems problem. And I've also done a bunch of work in industry in biomedical devices design and development. So I know a little bit about this innovation space in the medical technology as well. I'm not currently doing any COVID research, but I am following the developments closely because, as you may have guessed from my name, I'm Italian. I've got family, a lot of family back in Italy and friends, and obviously Italy was very, very badly hit. And also, so I've had, I've followed quite closely the development of the pandemic over in Europe, and and I have a general sort of keen interest for the medical space, so I've been quite interested in keeping up with the latest discovery. Before I start, I also wanted to comment on this format, which is a hackathon. So a hackathon is a great way to sort of mobilize ideas, so get fresh perspectives and just not be afraid of throwing things on the table. What if we tried to do that? This is really a great forum to do this without sort of feeling it's not a scientific conference where, you stand up against people who have much more sort of scientific seniority than yourselves. And, it's quite a free environment where you can innovate without too many preconceptions. And I think that's really good. The way I see a hackathon is it's usually a forum where you're trying to address emerging issues that need a fast response. And I suppose is one such thing. And the only thing I would say is that usually hackathon works best. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. Your audio is...
My audio is bad. All right, let me go and... No. I'll move somewhere else in the house. Let me see if that brings us some joy, although it shouldn't be bad where I am right now. Let me see.
It tends to break up a little and then return back to normal and then break up again.
Yeah. Okay, so is it still doing it here? Because I'm very, very close to my router right now. So
yours seems to be fine. It kind of
actually pretty clear right now, yeah.
It wigs out like after 5 minutes, and then like it wigs out for a minute, then it goes fine for 5 minutes, then like for 1 minute it's a little dead. It's
well, I don't have an alternative internet connection, but can people then let me know if it drops out again?
Yep.
Sure.
I will. The only other thing I can do to make sure we are stable is maybe tether with my phone, but that would be possibly a bit of a funny exercise. Look, I'll give it another go. You let me know if I drop off again.
Are you happy with us just verbally letting you know, or did you want us to?
Yeah, just jump in if I disappear, and because I can see everybody moving, so it seems an upload problem more than a download problem.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So what was I saying? Oh yes. So usually with a hackathon, we have a focus on small scale subtasks. So things that students, people who are not sort of highly experienced in the topic here, you can come up with some creative, innovative ideas to bring your contribution. So ingenuity is the main edge in a hackathon. And I suppose the way that the topic was framed here, which was, it was very, very broad. And so it will take us a while to break it up in a way that we can hopefully apply some ingenuity. And I hope I'll do a decent job of that. I wanted to tell you also that this is my first hackathon in this space. There have been a few around the globe, but there was a major Australian event in April, and I've linked it here because it had a large number of participants and lots of good ideas came from it. And so I suppose if you develop your own ideas, you want to go and see what some fellow students and other institutions did only a few months back. And also it might be interesting to see how the ground has shifted.
Nicolo, it's gone.
Oh, I'm gone.
Sorry.
All right.
Does anyone else have
go.
that, like, had that for the past bit, or is it just me?
Yeah, the audio is not clear. I mean, like after a minute, it just goes. Like,
I will try and go in a different spot, and then you can tell me hopefully if that works. I am actually going down to a whole different part of my house. I'm walking out in my garden and it's raining, so before my computer gets wet.
Oh no.
It's okay.
I think what I've noticed is when you are closer to the microphone, your voice is clear, but when you are far away, it just goes
All
haywire.
right. Well, I can plug in a headset here.
Yeah, maybe that will help. Yeah, just an observation.
No, that's all right. I want it to work. All right, I might just disappear for 1 second. I'm just switching network.
Sure, no worries.
All right, let's see. Can people hear me now?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, I've got my headset, so it's certainly not the microphone now. Alrighty, so what was I saying? Let me just go back to my slides here. Okay, so I was saying that there is a previous hackathon that's been done in this space, and I was suggesting that you maybe check it out in the process of formulating your own ideas, so you can see sort of what sort of ideas came out of a similar format in just a couple of months ago. And also interesting to see how the ground has shifted potentially in the past couple of months, because it's a very fluid, I suppose, field, that of the COVID pandemic. All right. So as I was saying, very broad topic for half an hour, minimizing and preventing infection. In fact, I think we're probably going to go a little bit over. I'm going to try and make it a little bit interactive. So I wanted to do a bit of brainstorming. We're going to do a little bit of that at a couple of points in this talk. And I just wanted you to jump in with such a small number of people, it's going to be easy. And tell me in a couple of words, what do you see as the biggest sort of pandemic challenge at the moment? So if you want to say, you know, why haven't we solved this thing yet? You know, why would you say that is? Don't be afraid, just jump in. It could be one part of a bigger picture, but just whatever part comes to you.
Online engagement for a large group of audiences. So for example, if you're a student in a class of 30, yes, we can engage in like a small group like right now because we're like a group of 8, but how do you maintain engagement for a class that when you're a huge class, for example, like 30 plus? We haven't really solved that problem yet.
Okay, so that I suppose is something that the pandemic has caused you, and you think, you know, that so far we haven't addressed very well. Okay, yeah, that's fine. I was more thinking in the sense of something that's like one of the missing links to get us to solve the pandemic issue in itself, rather than, you know, an issue that the pandemic has brought to us that we didn't have 3 months ago.
Oh, okay, sure.
But that's fine too.
So let me take a shot at it. I mean, it's just an idea. I think we're still not able to manage the economy, and because of which the governments across the world, they keep on loosening the restrictions, which again causes the resurgence to come back. So if there is a way to make sure that the economy works perfectly fine when all of us are in silos, maybe that'll help.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's certainly a thing. So there's a bunch of economies, and we'll actually talk about that towards the end. that are sort of teetering about, you know, whether they stay closed or they stay open, and they kind of vacillate, and the virus starts and stops and starts and stops and starts and stops. So not to mention other places where it's just kind of been let loose. So yes, absolutely, that is a problem in a coordinated global response, and we'll talk about that towards the end. Does anyone else have any sort of more, I don't know, sort of low level or technical things that they have on their mind? Otherwise, we can move on. But I was just curious.
I think it's people not following the restriction enough that's causing infection rate to rise.
Yeah.
So I think if we have stricter restriction and stricter punishment, maybe it will get people to follow the guidelines a bit better.
Okay, I think you and I have a slightly different philosophy, as you will find out towards the end, but I totally take your point. That absolutely, you know, there is a human behavioral component to this, and that is certainly playing against or certainly not in sync with the best laid plans to control the virus at the moment anyway. Does anybody else want to jump in?
I think the fact that we don't have much knowledge about the long-term effects of the virus, which also plays into the amount of conspiracy theories and stuff flying around, and which translates to, you know, not following guidelines or maybe not being careful with transmission. I think that's been a factor, especially in Australia.
Yeah, okay. No, that's certainly a thing, and it's very interesting that sort of everybody has sort of gone slightly at that higher level of my triangle there. So I'll just jump to that. Unless did someone else have any pressing things that they wanted to add?
Would a
okay.
basic like link is like we just don't know enough about how the virus works. For example, like we just like CSIRO publishes data is like, yes, it's similar to SARS. I can't remember what SARS represents. But it's like we don't know much about the structure. We don't even have a vaccine yet. We don't even have a vaccine about like some previous like known diseases that we currently have. So it's just like, is that
Absolutely.
sort of my level?
That is certainly a thing, right? So you've now gone right down to the bottom of my triangle there, of my multi-level triangle there, where the virus is right at the bottom. So clearly, if we could just have a weapon to kill the virus, we probably wouldn't have to worry about compliance with restrictions or any of that, because we would have eliminated the problem at that point, right? I suppose it's a case that, you know, whilst that's the end game, it might take us a while to get there, and there is a bigger, more complex response that we have to manage and put up with for quite some time, it seems. So that's a little bit the challenge there, and this sense of how can we contribute with our technological skills or our ingenuity to this effort. So absolutely. So I'll just sort of push ahead. If anyone's sort of been left behind, please, you know, be the first at the next sort of interactive moment in a few slides. So what I wanted to represent was with this triangle here on the right is that the problem we're looking at is a multi-level system problem. So we've got a virus, which is a chemical system, if you like, you know, and I will show you what the virus looks like to the best of our knowledge in a minute. And there are sciences that study this. There's virology, there's immunology, there's other sort of related branches of biology. Then what the virus does is it infects cells. And so that's when it actually starts to interact with another system. And I've sort of gone up a few steps here, not to make it too lengthy. That is our human body system level. Okay. And that is, you know, again, some of the things you guys said with that we don't really know how it ends up playing up with all our organ systems and, you know, the long-term consequences versus the immediate sort of symptoms. And so these are all things that we are trying to discover now, and they are more the domain of medical science and medical technology. And then you go over to the next level where we've got lots of individuals with the disease, or some individuals with the disease and some individuals without the disease that interact in a community. And then beyond that community, in a society, which could be made up of multiple communities which have slightly different characteristics. And then, as we were saying, some countries do one thing, some countries do another thing. So then our societies then interact in a bigger world, and everybody in the world is challenged by this problem at once. But the way that we the way that we can solve that problem is by coming together, but there's all different perspectives at play and different stories and different needs. And so can technology help us, bridge that to the extent that we can get a handle on this? So that's why I'm saying this is pretty massive task that we're looking at. So my talk really follows these three layers of the problem. So I'm going to start by telling you as much as I know without making this a biology lecture about the virus, and because I know the audience is potentially varied, and I don't know that everybody knows necessarily much technical stuff about how the virus behaves. And then on stage 2 I'll talk more about the disease, and in stage 3 I'll talk about more the higher level problem of us as humans facing the disease as a collective. So there we go. So I'll start off with the virus. So here's the virus. There's that image there on the top right is lurking there is just a very commonly one shown, probably because it is the one that's available on Wikipedia at the moment. And you've probably all heard the story that is now believed to be the most credible, but again, things might change, about where this coronavirus comes from, which seems to have originated in bats. So a virus with a so-called zoonotic origin. So bats have a bit of a funny immune system. Again, I don't know if you know this, where they carry a lot of different viruses, and their immune system has adapted so that it kind of prevents the viruses from getting out of control, but it doesn't fully eliminate them from the system. So they sort of naturally harbor natural sort of healthy carriers of a bunch of different viruses, and coronaviruses of different types are a typical species of virus, or not species is incorrect term, a variety of virus that is found in bats. And the idea is that at some point, probably there has been a jump of this virus from a bat to some other mammal, potentially, and that at that point there was a mutation that allowed the virus to become capable of infecting human cells as well. Because a lot of bat viruses remain in bats, and even if exposed, we wouldn't be affected. And now, as we know, this virus is well capable of human-to-human transmission, and it causes the disease that we call COVID-19. The virus is called SARS-CoV-2, which stands for SARS coronavirus 2. You guys were all probably very young in 2002, 2004. I was at uni at the time, and when there was the first epidemic of SARS. So SARS was also a respiratory syndrome that developed in parts of Southeast Asia mainly, and it was caused by a coronavirus, but it didn't become a pandemic like the current one. So I suppose, why am I telling you this story about the bats and so forth? It is because the history of the virus is actually very helpful for scientists to get to know the virus, to track it, and to fight it. So a lot of scientific work is being put into analyzing the genetic code of the virus, and that is what allows scientists to say this virus has very, very, very high degree of similarity with one that is found in bats. So that's possibly its likely origin. And if we again do this sequencing, we can have a look at how the virus that is currently in Australia is similar or different to the one that was in China a few months ago or is currently in the United States. And what that allows scientists to do is, because viruses mutate slightly between different transmissions, is the more time has passed in a chain of transmission, the more the viruses will start to be different. And so that is a way to track how the virus has moved around the globe. Also, if you know it comes from bats, you might be able to learn something from the bat immune system in terms of how bats manage to control this. So there's a bunch of valuable knowledge about the virus to be explored by sort of sequencing, analyzing, and comparing its genetic code. Again, I don't know how much you know about biology, but the main function of genetic code is actually to encode proteins. And proteins are essentially complex chemical species that drive the behavior of living cells and also viruses. And so essentially everything that happens in our body happens because there's some protein that enacts, or complex of proteins that enacts that particular behavior. And so and the proteins are a direct expression of the genetic code. And so by knowing the genetic code, one can predict what sort of proteins the virus can express. And by that, one can actually predict or I suppose study with a better understanding the way the virus interacts with its environment, which could be the physical environment. So for example, how well does it survive the environmental condition, or the infection environment? So how well does it stick to a human cell of a certain type or another? So all this can be understood very well at pretty low level if that understanding of the code that makes up the virus is there. And that obviously, as I say there, is useful for detection of the virus, for management and therapy. All these things are very much enhanced by that deep knowledge of the virus. A discipline that's coming through, now for a number of years, but it's certainly coming through very strongly in this very rushed fight against the second coronavirus here, is bioinformatics. So bioinformatics is just pretty much a specialized application of computer science methods to biological problems. And when you need to look at find similarities, patterns in these very long sequences of genetic codes, when you've got to simulate how a protein will react when it encounters another protein and so forth, these are very complex computational problems. And bioinformatics is now front and center of the response to the coronavirus, because it's actually allowing scientists to predict, model the potential interactions of the virus with a variety of possible environments. In case you don't know, I also want to tell you a couple of little things about what is a virus in general. So a virus is a bit of a bizarre thing, because from a biology perspective, is actually not even classified as a living thing. If some of you are more into computers, you would know that a virus is kind of just a really cleverly written piece of code that manages to, do messy things on your system and replicate itself and go on to another system. Now, it's called that way because that's exactly what a biological virus does. It's just a piece of genetic code that does this thing here. So this is the coronavirus here, this round membrane here. It's a cross section, and it has a bunch of proteins on the outside, and those proteins are encoded by this bundle of genetic code that's on the inside. So there's nothing else to it. That virus in itself will exist in that state, and it will not do anything. It would probably just degrade and disappear over time. The only time when it manages to do something is when it encounters a cell, and that's what you've got on the right-hand side here. So if it's the right cell that the virus can infect, then on the membrane of the cell on the outside, there will be some proteins that the virus can actually adhere to. And once the virus has managed to attach itself to the membrane of the cell, then there's a couple of different methods depending on the type of the virus, but it manages to either get inside or deploy its genetic material, that loopy thing there, inside the cell. And then what this thing does is essentially it takes over the protein making machinery of the cell. So the cell normally makes its own proteins for all its activities. Well, once the virus is in, it manages to take over that system to produce, guess what, a bunch of other copies of the virus. So the cell essentially becomes enslaved to this malicious actor, and which all the virus wants is to generate more and more and more and more viruses. Then depending on the type of virus, the cell can actually break, or it can remain alive and just eject the viruses on the other side. And I suspect that coronavirus is more of the second type. But very aggressive viruses like Ebola, for example, are more of the first type. They leave a trail of destruction where they go. So the idea is that the virus actually only exists and survives because it is made by us. And so in a way, it's a part of us, and that is becomes a part of us once it has infected us. And that is quite an interesting thing to remember when you're talking about how you fight this thing. And so the question people say is, okay, well, you know all that, so why can't you fix it? Okay, how is that different from any other virus? It isn't, but it also is. It is unique of the way that the coronavirus does it. So, but if you think about it more broadly, we don't actually have a cure for other viruses. Like there's no cure for a cold. There's no cure for a flu. You just get the cold, and then after a few days, you're better. Or you get a flu, and after a few days, you're better. So the reason why we don't have a cure is that the mechanism by which the viruses multiply is the same by which the cells sort of survive, make their own operations happen. And so that's not really a very practical target for disruption. If we stop the cells from generating more viruses, we kind of stop them from working altogether. And that would also be detrimental to the body. So the idea, and there's a bunch of different mechanisms by which this happens, and I've got them summarized in this diagram on the right, is that the immune system, so that part of our body that's designed to defend it from things that are not self, so not the body itself, actually can, once exposed to this foreign material, adapt and identify it as foreign, and in a couple of different sort of biochemical ways, it can either identify and remove viral material, or it can then identify and destroy cells that have been infected by viruses. But it takes a bit of time before this adaptation takes place. And in that initial time, the virus actually manages to grow and spread inside the host, and potentially get out of the host onto other people before before the body manages to fight it. So in order for this to happen, we must be exposed to the virus. So, and this happens either by catching the virus or by receiving a vaccine which is essentially an engineered form of significant fractions of the virus that are not sort of bad enough to start the replication chain, but they are good enough for the immune system to learn to recognize them. The other thing that I'll mention, and is up for discussion at the moment, is that immunity may not be permanent. So just because my body encountered a cold last year, or maybe a couple of months ago, it doesn't mean that I'm not going to get a cold ever again. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Some types of immunity indeed are not very long lasting, but for some viruses, there's actually a very high rate of mutation. So the next time that a cold virus comes along, it's actually only slightly different, but different enough from the one I caught the previous time. And so because of that, my body doesn't recognize it, and so I get another cold. So my children go to daycare at the moment, and they bring home a lot of different colds because we keep getting colds. And I'm hoping that my immunity vocabulary will soon be wide enough to stop getting colds. But it's an experience that's very present in my mind at the moment. But because of this concept of immunity, also it is possible to study whether people have or haven't been exposed to the coronavirus by testing for whether they have the antibodies in their system. So when you hear concepts like, so many percentage of people need to have developed immunity to the virus before we can talk about herd immunity. We might be able to reopen the economy by allowing out of isolation or out of lockdown people who already have the antibodies. That is what this is talking about. This is talking about identifying people who are at low risk of redeveloping the disease because they already have developed immunity. Now, in practice, there isn't enough data to know that for the new coronavirus, the immunity is strong enough to prevent a subsequent infection. So it's an open question. But in terms of the mechanism that the scientists are exploring, if you weren't aware of what it was about, you have it here. So why is this information useful? So understanding the chemistry and the biology of the virus is useful, obviously, because if you want to develop testing methods, a test is essentially some type of substrate, if you like, where the virus is likely to attach itself, and then you can detect that it is there, right? And so that is based on the chemistry of the virus. To identify vaccine targets, proposed therapies, and then to go to the next level. So understand and predict, once you have it, how is it going to react with you? And once you have it, what are the characteristics that will favor its spread and which ones will hinder it? So knowing a bit about the structure of the virus is important to try and predict some of this stuff. This is a level that for a student cohort is probably very hard to engage with, because it requires a high level of specialized expertise in some of these knowledge areas. But if you have sort of any ideas in this space, I would absolutely invite you to throw them out for brainstorming or a couple of comments in a second. I just wanted to give you sort of, from my perspective, sort of a bit of a broad sweep of what's happening in this space. So and I'm thinking from an engineering and sort of computer science sort of perspective, because that's the space I dwell in. If you have a different sort of origin, you might be able to add your own slant to this. So, technological support to enhance biology laboratory operations. So a lot of the stuff that's happening now with vaccines is being done in large batches. So there's a lot of automation potentially that can go on, both in the movement and the processing of samples, but also in the analysis. So, coding and things that can happen in order to, and I've got actually down the bottom, computing algorithms to facilitate data collation, navigation, processing, expediting what are really broad experimental campaigns. Imagine they might need to test thousands of target proteins for good attachment with the COVID. That is something that if you get a human operator to do, it will take a long time. If you have a good engineered automatic system, it will be much quicker. Again, a little bit, this is a bit of a discipline sort of based concept, bringing engineering and computing insights and approaches into the biological sciences. So I was talking about bioinformatics before, but I've linked a few sort of papers you can read there for additional interest. They're reasonably general, and they say, how can computer scientists or how can tissue engineers bring their expertise into the COVID space? And there's certainly areas where those skills are quite complementary to the skills of traditional biologists. From a very sort of engineering perspective, an immediate application of knowing how the virus works in itself and on its periphery is materials with antiviral properties. So detecting what makes a good disinfectant for this particular virus, or can people develop a surface coating that inactivates the virus because it disrupts its membrane. If you did that, then that would be a surface that you never need to clean, because it's always ridding itself of the virus. So that would be, say, a very good solution for high use type of surfaces like door handles or lift buttons or things like that. And there are certainly research efforts in that space at the moment. Did anyone want to jump in or have any ideas or I don't know, just things that they wanted to bring to the before I move on to part 2?
While it's ethically questionable, last year that scientist in China who ended up modifying the genetic DNA or the genetic information of a few fetuses to give them immunity to HIV.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know if that's something that is being considered if no other avenues pop up at all? for long term?
I think that that will be in the mind of a few mad scientists, but at the moment the scientific community would be extremely opposed to that. There's probably a lot of milder forms of gene tampering, you know, by the form of gene therapy and things like that that are being attempted at the moment. And even those, sometimes they're a little bit, you know, borderline in terms of what is acceptable. If you're talking about sort of tinkering with embryos, I think you will get a lot of I mean, I understand the potential scientific value, but I also think that from an ethics standpoint, it is very very shaky ground. So you'll certainly might see some of those things in animals, particularly, you know, heavily used lab animals like rats and things like that. But before you see that in humans, I think it will be a long time. But you know, again, it needs must sometimes. But I definitely see it as a very long shot at this point in time.
Yeah. Definitely.
I can see, and hopefully I'll give you this sense. By the time we get to the end, I think I will convince you that we can get there without being so daring, I suppose. At this point in time. All right. Now moving on to. Oh, sorry. Did anybody else want to jump in with any thoughts or comments?
I was actually going to comment on Christian's point about the whole modification thing, because if this is the case that I'm thinking of about the, I wouldn't say illegal, but like in the scientific community, there was explicitly a don't do CRISPR on fetuses and explicitly went against that. I think the reason why we don't want to do that just yet is because it's like coronavirus. We don't know the long-term effects of whether it actually gives them HIV immunity, because they haven't grown up yet. And so what happens if like they end up being if they end up being like paralyzed the waist down, but end up being like HIV immune, then I guess this is like Nicolo did mention, it is very much ethically debatable. In terms, I think it'd be really interesting to see how also from an engineering point of view and a microbiology point of view is how we conduct this sort of testing, because I think you need certain clearances to actually be working on the virus itself. And how do we as engineers create more environments for people to research in? Because I think they have like 4 levels of like security, like a box inside a box inside a box inside a security building. So how do we?
This is a level 4 virus, so it's probably as bad as they contain them. So
yeah, so
there's certainly limited environments too. But I mean, a lot of these studies, for example, are done first on, you know, because for example, if you're looking at just thinking, for example, of antibacterial surfaces, you can actually look at the specific response of membrane proteins to, you know, particular electrostatic conditions and whatnot. And you can do that without necessarily having the protein on the coronavirus itself. So I suspect that there's quite a bit of research that can be done before you go the full hog with the live virus. And a lot of people, I suspect, are working in those conditions because, as you say, the containment facilities are very few across the globe. Yeah. Anyway, guys, just in the interest of time, I'll jump onto 2. So part 2 is the disease. So now, I mean, that's potentially quite abstract unless you're really sort of interested in the microbiology side of things. And now we get into the disease, and the disease which is called COVID-19. We hear a lot about this. You know, I've got the symptoms on the right-hand side there. You know, everyone's been told to keep an eye out for those, because if you have them, you might want to go and get a test. And so COVID-19 is the official name of the disease generated by the SARS coronavirus 2. And I mean, this is point of clarification that not everybody else knows, you know, that SARS-CoV-2 is the virus and COVID-19 is actually the disease that the virus generates. I think now in such popular usage, the two things have kind of become interchangeable, but there is a reason why they have 2 different names. So as we know, it's a highly infectious disease. And its main space, I suppose, where it dwells is the respiratory system. And because of that, it is highly infectious, because obviously we cannot refrain to breathe. And if the virus is in there, when we talk, when we even if we are not actively and abundantly coughing and sneezing and sputtering, but even just by talking, we are generating, microparticles of saliva and so forth, which are then spread in the surfaces around us. And if they are contaminated, then they can be picked up by somebody else. So respiratory diseases are amongst the most transmissible diseases because of that, because we just spread them around as we breathe and talk, which we do a lot of. Obviously, because the pathogen is unknown to humans, as I was just saying, there's no immunity. And so that's the reason also why pretty much everybody who is exposed to it in any significant way seems to come down with the disease in one form or other. And the main way in which it gets into people is by self-infection. So if you touch a contaminated surface and then you touch your mouth or your nose or your eyes typically, so your mucosae, or you have direct exposure to someone's droplets. So someone coughs in the vicinity of you and the little wet things eventually manage to get onto your eyes or onto your lips or onto your nose. So there we go. And that's why, that's why we talk about self-isolation. That's why we talk about those, self-isolation, social distancing. And that's why, there's limits on gatherings because of this. If someone coughs in the middle of a crowded pub, then a lot of people potentially are exposed to that aerosol. An interesting thing, and makes part of the mystery of this disease, is that the severity is highly variable amongst people. So the confirmed trends at the moment are that there's high mortality in the elderly and in patients that have particular types of comorbidities. There's a bunch of typical ones like heart disease, diabetes, hypertension. There's a list of reasonably typical pathologies or disease that people tend to have in higher numbers from middle age onwards, and that tends to also precipitate mortality in that age group. Unlike other respiratory viruses, children don't seem to get it very readily, and asymptomatic carriers are possible. You probably all heard about the super spreaders, which are these evil characters that populate the world and catch the virus, and then they inadvertently give it to a lot more people because they have it, but they don't know that they have it. One thing that makes this disease very scary is that occasionally, but not uncommonly, it comes down as a very severe disease in individuals that are otherwise fit and healthy. So, whilst you have a lot of people dying in that sort of frail age group, you also have, especially in countries where there have been a lot of cases, a non-insignificant number of young, fit and healthy people who have ended up in intensive care and have even died as a result of this disease. And I think that is one of the reasons why people are so concerned, because there's not always a profile that allows you to predict where the disease is going to go. And so everyone's a bit wary that if they can avoid it, they'll try not to catch it. It's not like a cold, you can say, well, I'll get a cold and I'll get over it. With this one, people are a little bit more suspicious. And then there is this, other fact that also is mysterious and still being studied, that some individuals, most individuals get better within 2-3 weeks or so. The people in intensive care sometimes take a lot longer, but sometimes there are people with non-severe symptoms who remain virus positive for an extended period of time. Even people whose immune system is otherwise perfectly normal and healthy. And these people are colloquially called the COVID-19 long haulers. So people who have had COVID-19 for months and they still can't shake it. And that is also something that hasn't been observed with other coronaviruses. And so it's a bit of a mystery of medical science that is being investigated.
Do you know why, has there been any leading theories about what if there's like a common factor between severity of cases? Because I saw something about vitamin D intake levels being somewhat linked to severity, but it wasn't a across the board thing. Do you know if there's anything that
there's a lot of things that are not across the board, and I think that that's really the tricky thing at the moment, is that there isn't a clear pattern of behavior. So there are some things. So if you're elderly, if you have those complications, then yes, your risk is much higher. But otherwise, there are some unexplainable causes for this disease in certain people, and obviously there must be an explanation, but it hasn't actually been elucidated yet. And that's where, yeah, I suppose we'll talk about it. That's potentially where technology can help us make a difference. I wanted to bring you this because, again, I don't know how maybe some of you are down with the latest on this and some people are not. I've linked you just a Science magazine article that talks about some of these things if you're interested in reading more. And so COVID-19 has a variety of effects on the human body. So in the beginning, everybody was talking about people getting this cough, which then becomes a terrible pneumonia type of event on the lungs. And people then end up in intensive care on ventilators and sort of like a very serious pneumonia, and a bunch of people don't make it. In reality, what is appearing now is that the disease is a lot more complex than that. They are finding evidence of damage, quite frequent evidence of damage now in critical blood vessels, inside the heart muscle, inside the kidney tissue. There are bizarre effects on the brain. So people who complain of prolonged fogginess, inability to think straight, fatigue, confusion, loss of sense of smell and taste. And these are all, say, neurological consequences as well. And none of the previous similar viruses that were known actually had this diverse pattern of behavior. So much so that some doctors are now saying that some people die because of respiratory dysfunction, but other people are due to the fact that their lungs fill up with fluid and they can't exchange oxygen anymore. But other people die of something that looks a lot more like microclots that form in their bloodstream and then plug their alveoli, so the little gas exchange sacs, the circulation to the little gas exchange sacs in their lungs. And that is actually the reason why ultimately their respiratory exchange fails. So not on the air side, but on the blood side. And I was reading an article today, which I didn't know about, but there's a doctor who is trialing some alternative dialysis treatment. So essentially putting people on an artificial kidney machine, because they are observing, again, a not uncommon event where people accumulate acute kidney damage from direct distribution of the virus to the kidney tissue as well. And again, your lungs might be doing okay or just managing, your blood system might be just managing, but if your kidneys start to fail, then your body starts to poison itself with its own waste products, and that is something that can precipitate multiple organ failure or things of that sort. So really what I'm reading these days, which actually was not apparent even 2 months ago, is that doctors are more and more treating coronavirus like an infection that for some people it is respiratory, but for the people who then move on to the more severe stage, becomes essentially like a systemic viral infection of the whole body, like a viral sepsis if you are a doctor. Okay, and a sepsis is a very complicated medical event, and even standard protocols don't get it right for people. And so, that gives you possibly a sense of the scale of the challenge we have here. So we have a disease that goes from giving people nothing or no symptoms, and giving other people essentially whole body organ failure out of poisoning their own blood. That's really the spectrum of things that we're looking at. And so I think there's good reason to be afraid of this virus. It's certainly not a bad cold or sort of like the flu, like people were saying in the early days, to not to get people too worried. One theory that was circulating a while ago, which was the theory of the cytokine or a storm. So this idea that the inflammation starts from the lungs and then the body itself propagates it to the rest of the tissues. So it wasn't actually the virus that gets in everywhere, but it's the body that overreacts. And as a result of that, it sends through a cocktail of like really aggressive chemicals throughout the whole system, and that tends to damage a lot of other organs, is increasingly being put into question based on my reading, and it seems to be a lot more related to direct activity of the virus. So this is all very new discovery, and it has implications on therapeutic choices. So for example, we'll talk about that I think in a couple of slides, but there was a lot of talk about everyone needing ventilators. And these days, and my chats with intensive care doctors in the past week have confirmed this, ventilators are much less of a concern because a number of people are probably better treated on things other than ventilators, and they need lesser respiratory support, because the problem of the lungs is not the only main problem that they're trying to solve. Anyway, so these are all sort of interesting things that have been that are being tossed around at the moment in the medical literature about the disease. So then the question everyone wants to ask is, treating this thing, do we have a cure? And the answer is, I just said before in the other section, is no, because it's a virus. So the body needs to find its own way to get rid of this intruder. And all the therapies that you might have heard about, and again, I linked to you a few articles here if you want to read more, are essentially just support therapies, and they seem to be hit and miss. So they sometimes have little cohorts where they have some success, but then when tried on a bigger population, it seems to cease to have significance. So again, it strengthens this idea that this virus has different manifestations in different people. So it needs to be unlocked to the core yet. But key sort of pharmacological therapies, just so that to give you a sense, people are trying anti-inflammatory stuff to try and tone down that maybe excess inflammatory response from the body. Antiviral drugs that essentially target some of those replication mechanisms that the virus engages in. And now there are anticoagulant therapies in that. So when I was saying that there is damage to the blood vessel that causes microclotting, so the idea is that anticoagulant support might actually help people maintain some of their lung function better because they don't get their capillaries stuffed with microemboli. Biological treatments, there's the plasma therapy. So now that a number of cases have, and many people have had the virus, there starts to be, especially in the United States, where there are a lot of people who have had it, availability of donor plasma of people who have the antibodies. And that has showed some promise, but again, only if given very early and only in certain categories of patients. So, so again, a therapy that seems to help some people, but not everybody. And then there's the mechanical support therapy. So I was just mentioning to you about ventilation, so lung support. So when people's lung tissue is damaged, the lung doesn't inflate properly, or the lung subunits don't inflate properly anymore. And so the mechanical ventilation assures that there is sufficient gas being pumped into the lung and out of the lung at regular intervals, and should maintain the ventilation. The downside of that is that actually over time tends to stress the lung tissue even more. So, long-term mechanical ventilation is not a particularly good thing for patients, but it is a last resort therapy when people's lungs are heavily compromised. And then dialysis, as I was saying, so kidney support for people who seem to have kidney damage from this disease. The idea is that all these drugs try to prevent the body from getting to a tipping point where the whole body system becomes dysfunctional, and you get into a situation where you've got either excessive lack of oxygen, so tissues start to die, or other types of chemical poisoning of your body that lead to multiple organ failure. So now that you know this, I think I can put this message through that it's true in general that preventing a disease is better than curing it, But when your cures are so sketchy, you certainly want to go down the prevention route if you can. So that's why the focus, a very, very big focus, is still on personal protection equipment, community measures, and of course, you know, the mad rush that everyone wants to get a vaccine that works in everybody so that we can all forget about this virus, because it'll stop being able to infect people in a massive way. So again, back to, I sort of looped again to the end of this section. So what's the usefulness of this information? So studying and understanding the interaction between the human body system, the virus system, and the therapy system here, because you've got, you know, again, engineered systems that then come into the body to compensate for the virus effects, is essential to minimize the risks to the patient. So we choose to do something that gives us the best likelihood of success and the least likelihood of adverse outcomes, or some type of trade-off in between. If we have a good understanding of how those systems interact, we can explore that trade-off. And that's what doctors try to do. And, you know, biological modeling can actually help doctors achieve that. Physiological modeling can help doctors achieve that. And of course, also to prioritize research direction. So if you're trying to understand something as a system, you figure out where you're missing a link. And that's maybe the next thing you need to study if you want to, you know, unbundle the question that you're faced with. So some of the things I was saying, we don't know why in some people it reacts aggressively in certain tissues and not in others. So is there a genetic predisposition, for example? So there's a bunch of hypotheses that, having identified this interaction, then throws up for research. And the way to address this is again applying best practice in the design, selection, and use of therapeutic options and protective devices. And what guides best practice is knowledge of what has happened until now. And I've got a couple of slides, a note on medical devices here. So I'll just mention something here, and I've got, it's just kind of an aside about that, because I think that's an interesting space for engineering students. What was I saying there? Oh, yes. So this idea that we are accumulating a body of knowledge, but we need to pull it apart in order to identify those links. And it comes from different places with different sort of approaches to medical therapy, different ways of classifying, you know, the same clinical conditions and so forth. So technology can help us, and I'll talk about that in a little while, can help us to create sort of a unified repository for all that information, so that we can find those patterns, we can find those commonalities between what's otherwise seem to be very different manifestations. So a note of medical devices. So I mentioned before about the ventilators, because when I was talking to some people a couple of weeks ago, when I was first asked to do this, about, you know, engineering innovation for COVID, everyone was like, oh yeah, everyone just started building ventilators. And, you know, you had people who were making car parts who suddenly decided that they wanted to make ventilators. You had a bunch of sort of resources that were put behind ventilators. From the things I've told you, you've appreciated that ventilators are still a thing, but not as much of a thing. And also, it's been 3-4 months since the beginning of the pandemic. Ventilator manufacturers have pumped out a lot of ventilators out of their factories in the meantime. So the shortage of ventilators is not really a thing. So if out of your hackathon you were thinking, I'm going to design yet another ventilator, probably not the thing that's most needed at this point in time. Although I appreciate that it's a pretty cool problem for engineers. Where ventilators might be an issue, maybe in some countries where there are weaker health systems, but I think the issue there is that their health system doesn't have the money to purchase the equipment. Not that the equipment is not available per se. But again, I think it's certainly less of a pressing issue now than it was 3 or 4 months ago. So the much more current focus is certainly on personal protective equipment, and we'll talk about that in a little minute. As engineers or technically minded people, you might have in mind something that looks a bit like a medical aid of some sort or a medical device of some sort. And both the personal protective equipment and the ventilator or the dialysis machine, or I don't know, the syringe that goes into a particular part of the patient, the intubation tube, whatever, name it, is a medical device. And those things are strictly regulated, obviously, because of the desire to protect the safety of patients who are then treated with these devices. And there are sort of reasonably defined industrial standards for how certain things are built, especially personal protection equipment. Before these things can hit the market, they actually need to be approved by the national regulator. So every country has a regulator. In Australia, it's the Therapeutic Goods Administration. So if you jump out of your hackathon and say, I've thought of this fantastic idea to do a new face shield or a new, mask that's super repellent to the virus, that device, which might be a genial idea, will take a bit of time before it can be used by people, because it needs to be registered as a new medical device, and you will need to prove that it meets all of those essential compliance requirements. So medical devices, unfortunately, have a bit of a long development cycle because of that. And in a pandemic, that can actually be a detrimental, because you can't bring innovation to market super quickly. Having said that, the TGA has put in place some expedited processes for the purpose of COVID dedicated innovation. And I have linked their page up here. You find all the references in my final slide, where you can find some more information if your ideas take you down that path. The general thing that I want to mention to you is that medical devices are classified in 3 different classes. Well, it's actually 4, but it's 1, 2A, 2B, and 3. So it's kind of 3, depending on their invasiveness and risk profile in relation to what they do to the patient. So you can imagine that something that goes inside the heart is super high risk, super critical. It's the highest class. And the surgical mask, which doesn't enter the body at all and it stays on the outside or in front of your face, is the class 1, which is the lowest risk sort of category. Okay, so typically PPE are typical class 1, and ventilator components are class 1 or class 2A, because they go in the body but only in the mouth and throat, and they are short term. So they're not a super high class. Depending on what you're thinking of, you might end up in the higher classes. Obviously, the higher your risk class is, the more lengthy your approval process becomes, the more you have to demonstrate safety of your system. If you're designing something that's just a variation of something that already exists, sometimes that allows you to get the approvals done a little bit more quickly, obviously, because there's a baseline of acceptance of that product on the market already. Things to be mindful of is what the TGA does is very different to what the United States Food and Drug Administration does. So if you have a clever idea in Australia, you'll probably have to rejig it a lot before the equivalent body in the United States also gives you the green tick, at least in terms of documentation you will need to provide to prove the safety of your system. So here's the personal protective equipment. I wanted to talk about it because it's a big thing at the moment. The goal of PPE is essentially preventing the disease from getting into people, and so essentially the virus getting into eyes, nose, and mouth, so our exposed mucosae. And we see here's a nurse getting all donned up, and so what she has is a face shield to protect her eyes, a mask or respirator to protect the airway, and gloves and aprons, which are not strictly required, but in the sense that you can touch the virus and not get sick, but the risk is that then you will touch yourself. So that part of it is to prevent virus to be resident on the outside of your body, such that you then will be likely to infect yourself by accident. So I wanted to mention PPE because there are big challenges associated with it. One is supply. A lot of our PPE comes from China, for example, and in the very early days of the pandemic, there was a concern that the disruption to the supply chains would mean that we don't have enough PPE here to cater for our own needs. Fortunately, that didn't eventuate, although it was a bit touch and go for a little while. I can certainly tell you that in Italy, for example, it was one of the earliest hit countries. They were definitely running out of masks in the beginning because the supply chains from China were disrupted. So the idea is, are we going to devise new, efficient, local manufacturing solutions for some of these things? That might be in our own interest as a country to be more self-sufficient and safer with respect to global disruption. A big thing, I'll mention it here and I'll come back again to it because it's hot off the press, this stuff at the moment. I heard there was a big petition put forward by a bunch of respectable doctors this week about this. It's fitness for purpose. You may have heard that in Melbourne, a lot of healthcare workers, including doctors and nurses in major hospitals, have come down with COVID-19. And those people were wearing PPE. So the question is, why did they get it? Are the current PPE recommendations insufficient? So while the National Panel for Personal Protection, or whatever it's called, comes up with a new recommendation, the questions the doctors have is, we are wearing these masks, but no one has actually fit tested them properly. So I don't know if you've ever worn, just to do some DIY or whatnot, a dust mask. You will have noticed that it only takes you scrunching your face a little bit to actually have little gaps of air that can come in through the side. And a simple law of physics is that flows go through the path of least resistance. So if you have a little gap, the mask doesn't seal properly around your face, and there is aerosol of COVID in the air, it will get around the mask and get in from behind if there is a gap there. And what I know for a fact, because I've spoken to hospital workers, including in Canberra, is fit testing is not done as a matter of course, which would mean putting a mask on somebody and doing a test that confirms that there's no air leakages around their face. Not all types of mask fit everybody. So that will create a supply issue because you would need to have the right brand of mask for every staff member that fits it or doesn't fit it. Okay. So at the moment, the health authorities don't want that problem. And we are seeing that play out in some environment where COVID is becoming prevalent. So certainly, if I was to point people in a direction, trying to make the problem of mask fitting or PPE fitting less of a burdensome problem for the people who are administering health services is certainly a big thing at the moment. Other things, of course, that are important are user education, best practice. So actually, people need to know what they're doing, be guided to do what they need to do in the right way. And the other thing that's also coming through is environmental issues. So everyone has all these single-use things and they're being thrown out now in huge numbers. So is sustainability of masks now the next thing? Now, of course, as people who walk around the street, we can use the reusable fabric ones. But what about the millions of disposable masks that are being consumed? Should they be recyclable, biodegradable, or other things like that? Are they piling up? Like one of the biggest environmental hazards, I think, in terms of produced waste, household waste, is nappies from babies, right? Because you produce so many and they're very hardly biodegradable. You think babies are small, but they use a lot of them and they eventually pile up. So I wonder if we're looking at a similar crisis for PPE. So here we go. Challenges and opportunities in this space, and then over to you for some commentary. What I see here as a broad sweep in this space is computational techniques to effectively manage the large amount of publications and scientific results that are being accumulated here. I was looking around and there are certainly machine learning efforts going on about identifying consensus from thousands of papers and clustering them so essentially doing automatic systematic reviews of the literature through machine learning because there are tens of thousands of papers. It's becoming an unwieldy task for any human. And the other thing that's very much machine learning oriented is the idea of discipline ontologies. So the idea that you have a common vocabulary by which everyone who is treating a COVID patient goes to classify events and outcomes and so forth, so that all those bodies of research are immediately comparable and they can build on each other. In different places that have different practices, if things are called in different ways, they may not be immediately comparable. And so that's to the detriment of the advancement of the body of knowledge. Other things, retooling of manufacturing processes to support demands for specific goods. I was mentioning about the car part manufacturers who were doing ventilators, but it could be, you know, anything else of the sort. But that idea is certainly contribution that engineers can make. Technology to assist individuals in engaging in better protective behaviors. So if people understand better, or the people designing these things understand how COVID can get to you, that maybe you can design a good user-friendly way of helping people do the right thing, washing their hands for long enough, or remembering to put in their mask on if there's someone within 1.5 meters. I don't know, you name it, right? But this sort of idea here. Enhancements to PPE, I have mentioned these, so I won't repeat myself. Any thoughts from you guys?
Just a general thought. The whole like getting the same terminology together to analyze like the data published and like scientific papers. That's really interesting. And I know that I think you were giving a talk at the Applied Modeling in Acute Care.
You were
conference.
there last year.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Oh wow, you remember me.
Yep.
I guess it's just like I'm pretty sure one of the speakers there, I think it was Hannah, was talking about e-learning to figure out the writing out doctors' reports. So I guess could we reverse that and like get a doctor's report, take out the words that we want?
Yes, it's a two-way process and absolutely works that way as well. So if you have a look at that, I don't know if it's that reference or there's another one anyway in there. There's actually a grand challenge out there, or you can Google. There's a grand challenge about using natural language processing technique, which is a discipline of machine learning, to actually interpret what I was saying, interpret papers and essentially do systematic reviews of a body of work in a particular area. So I don't know, studying this particular protein or this particular drug, and then actually bringing all those results together without a human having to read all that material and interpret it. So in a way, it is what you're saying. It is certainly a thing, and there's so much production in such a short time now that it is becoming a need in the scientific community.
And just to add on to that though, because I haven't written a paper, and so I guess I would like to get your idea on this, Nicolo. Do a lot of papers out there, are they published in English with English vocabulary with I guess like the intention for English words? Because sometimes when you translate things or when you're trying to describe something in your natural language, you might describe it a certain way, but when you have to transcribe it into English, it might not be described adequately. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that is a problem that is progressively reducing over time. Certainly if you read papers from 15, 20 years ago, it was a big issue. I think now international conferences have unified a little bit the communities. And so at least on the specific terminology that is about comparing results and things, there is more consistency. You will find, you know, idiomatic expressions that only make sense if you retranslate them in the original language, and in English they look very odd, but they wouldn't make up the core message of the paper, if you know what I mean, typically. Although, I mean, until someone does a systematic ontology effort, and that is, which means having that standardized backbone to the discipline in terms of language, and if you like, the community agreeing willingly to use that, then the risk for things falling out of that order is certainly there. Yeah.
Cool, thank you.
All right, I'll jump to 3, the pandemic. So at the population level, things get really messy. So this is a paper I found that talks about a systems approach to preventing and responding to COVID-19. And I looked at this and I thought, I can probably add another 4 or 5 loops to this, and you know, it will look even messier, but probably there can be even more things feeding into this web of interconnection. So we don't need to go through it in any sort of super thorough way, but at the core of this thing, as I write in this slide here, there's a feedback loop, which is this red thing here, okay, which is a very basic thing. You've got a certain number of infectious people. There's a certain risk of transmission of the infection. So many transmission events occur, and as a result of that, more people get sick, and this thing just continues. If the gain of that loop, so obviously if while we go around this loop, we end up with more people than we had before we started, then you can see that that trajectory of that loop is one of growth, potentially exponential growth of some sort. Okay, and so the role of all this other black stuff around it, pretty much, is to apply sort of human-driven interventions to reduce the gain, so the multiplier of that loop. If you manage to reduce it to below 1, then your cases progressively will decrease until hopefully they go to 0. Okay, and one comment I have here is that you look at some of these factors: public performance of protective behaviors, trust in authorities, public awareness, public perceived risk, public outrage, novelty of the disease, stigma about being sick. So these are very human behavioral type of events, and they're really hard to model. So while we can write, I can say that this needs to be a multiplier of more than 1 or less than 1, how all of these things transform that number is something that's pretty much impossible to quantify. And that's why it is impossible to quantify, if not in a post hoc way to say, well, I'm going to look at the situation in Melbourne, Victoria in this period of time, and I can say that the multiplying factor is 1.3 at the moment, right? But it doesn't tell you, which factor you need to tinker and by how much to fix the problem. It's a very interconnected and complex web. And that's just one community or one society, even, because you've got public authorities and so forth. If you throw in the fact that you've got Australia, which does a thing, New Zealand a different thing, the US a different thing, Russia a different thing. So at a global level, and the pandemic exists in that global scale, this becomes essentially a non-controllable problem. We can maybe control it in a small subspace, but as with our own individual action, or even the decision makers that affect us, that are closer to us, so our local governments or our national governments, are unable on their own to resolve the pandemic, because other agents elsewhere in the world may be recklessly letting the virus go rampant in their society because they think that they're going to save the economy, which was the conversation we were having right at the beginning. So I just wanted to bring you a couple of examples here of successes and failures, and also to show you that there's more to this than meets the eye. And sometimes it's just a matter of luck. And in fact, I think the story of Melbourne tells us that a little bit. So I've got 2 examples here. One is a first wave example, one's a second wave example. The first example is Italy, because I have direct knowledge of the place. And it was one of the first countries after China that had a major explosion of the disease, and it went just super wild. In some towns, the hospitals were overflowing and the army was taking away dead bodies on trucks. Like, it was really a bad look for a country that has a pretty decent health system at the best of times. So what went wrong with Italy, and can we relate that to our loop thing here? So things that happened in Italy were, it got hit early. So that means that there wasn't knowledge of the disease. People didn't actually know exactly how severe it was. The authorities didn't even know how severe it was. And the testing capability wasn't particularly well developed. So testing was quite slow. There weren't a lot of test kits available. And so if you go and look at this, and also because Italy is a country that economically has been limping for a few years, the politicians weren't too keen to say, oh, let's all shut everybody up just in case. They said, oh no, look, it's probably okay. A few people are getting sick, but it's not going to be too bad. So, and to combine with that, Italians have traditionally a bit of a funny relationship with their government in the sense that they listen to the government, but then if they think they know better, they do whatever they want anyway. Maybe you visited other countries that work like that. They don't usually work too well. But if you go trust in authorities and you drop this, okay, then effectiveness of public health risk communication also will drop, okay? And so the public performance of protective behaviors also will drop. When they started saying, oh, maybe people need to socially distance, Italians said, oh yeah, but they're very social people. So they tried to stay together anyway, to the extent that still seemed to be okay. So their public perceived risk was low. So all these factors that then, when raised, actually have a negative effect on the risk of transmission, they actually were quite low. And so they didn't diminish the risk of transmission. So as the first wave of the virus went through, it just infected a bunch of people. And then what you had is that obviously that dropped the effectiveness of the ability to do contact tracing. And so as a result, then the control of that feedback loop was just not there, and the cases just exploded, okay? Compare that with Australia. Once the government then finally put in hard measures and lockdown and whatnot, Italy actually resolved its own curve by pretty much reverting its earlier mistakes, and it actually dropped it. It ended up having less overall cases than comparable countries like the UK or Spain, right? So they didn't do things badly. They just started off on the wrong foot, and the virus managed to get itself in a position where that loop gain couldn't be brought down to below 1 very quickly. And that led to a bunch of people being affected. So if you compare this with Australia, Australia got its cases in numbers anyway, a little bit later. So there was more testing capability. There was a stronger, more sort of uniform institutional response, and generally Australians are more trusting of their government. So their public messaging was taken very seriously first straight away. Australia has the advantage that it has stronger borders. So I didn't say that, but Italy could have people with disease sort of coming in through the border in the early days, and it wasn't clear who was bringing it in, who was taking it out, who was, you know, whereas Australia just closed its sea and air borders, and that made it a much more controllable environment, obviously. And so, you know, kind of like the other side of the medal, you know, the things that Italy lacked, Australia did probably comparably well at. And you can see that just by sheer luck, I suppose, Australia, or you know, a predisposition, Australia managed to avoid such a big, terrible event. Also true that Italy has higher population density, especially in the areas that were hit, than Australia. So even just the sheer likelihood of people crossing paths with each other was much higher. So in a way, this reminds me of what happened in the second wave in Melbourne, where, you know, everything was going well. And then suddenly what happened in Melbourne, there was a breach of hotel quarantine. So a few virus cases got out. And what had happened at that point? Well, people had been around the streets for a couple of months, having some restrictions, but not really seeing anything much happening. And so they had become a little bit complacent. They had developed habits that didn't really incorporate hard virus control into them. And so when the virus started spreading, they weren't quite ready to change quickly enough to adapt to the virus. And so now they are feeling the consequences. And to rein that in, Daniel Andrews has had to do pretty much what the Italian Prime Minister did, which was order people into lockdown into their own homes, maximum radius so many kilometers from your house, just to really cut down on that social contact. Compare that with the Northern Territory, which had very hard borders and very strict quarantine enforcement. In fact, they started making people pay for their quarantine very early on. So no one had a desire to go to the NT and quarantine there because it was very expensive. And so as a result of that, they pretty much got to elimination within their borders. And it was not that the health services or the population of the NT is any better than the population of Victoria. It's just that the policy settings around it were compatible, I suppose, with the needs of the virus, or, you know, the needs of what needs to be done for the virus not to grow. So the reason why I want to highlight this is that, and also this section 3 of the talk, is the scientific discoveries will help us kill the virus. Right? Absolutely. If we find the vaccine, the virus is dead in the water. Done. But even if we don't get there, there is actually a society-wide response that can help us defeat a pandemic regardless. There have been plenty of pandemics in history. In the 1600s, there was the bubonic plague. Medicine didn't even exist, but the human race is still here, 400 years later. That's because people adapted and they found a way to work together that met the need of their herd, I suppose, to be safe from the virus. And even in the United States, I heard from some people I know, where things are going rampant, apparently, in some of the first hit cities, the cases in hospitals are now dwindling and there's very few people in intensive care, because even if the legislators aren't telling them to stay home, people have learned to do the right thing to protect themselves and their fellow citizens. So I like to take a sort of a positive message out of this, that innovating for the pandemic can have two faces of it. One is to address the purely scientific challenge that there's some knowledge there that we are missing. We need to gather it in order to unlock the mystery of how we fix it. But the other one is another maybe more reachable secret that we need to conquer, which is how do we find a way to work together as a good team to keep the virus out, I suppose. And I think that that's where people with ingenuity, even if they don't have the massive knowledge in virology or microbiology or advanced dynamical systems, they can still provide a valuable contribution. So it's by looking at the needs of the people. And this is where I would defer with someone who said, I want more enforcement. And my take is actually that people would do the right thing, but for some reason they find themselves in a personal situation where they can justify to themselves, or they have circumstances that sort of push them to do the wrong thing, allow them to accept for themselves that they will do the wrong thing. And so I throw a technological challenge to help with technology to create a better environment where those circumstances don't arise. Okay, I'll give you a couple of examples right at the end of this thing. So the very positive message here is, united, the human race can stand against a global disaster. Divided, it will fare much worse. And it can win even without necessarily understanding everything about the virus. And I think that or having to edit the genes of embryos, that's sort of the message I was giving you earlier. And I've got this intersection diagram here about human-centered design. I don't know if any of you have ever encountered this, but the idea is that innovation sits sort of in the middle of this intersection here of technical feasibility, desirability, which is what is good for the people, okay, and viability, which is what governments or businesses are willing to support. Okay, so you can pinpoint an idea, okay, that is valuable to whoever is going to support it, so a government or a business, is technically feasible and does the right thing by people, then that is usually a winning approach to innovate. And as you think of your hackathon ideas, I would invite you to try and think about these three components. You can have fantastic ideas that are too complex and then people won't take them up, or very heartwarming ideas that a business is not willing to support. So you need to find that magic trio of things there that's going to give you the winning ticket. So here's my last brainstorming, and then I promise I've got 2 slides to the end, which goes into this concept I was saying. What behaviors do we desire to have to do the right thing? But the current circumstances around us are making that difficult. Okay, so I'll give you some examples. My wife had a sore throat last week. She went for a COVID swab. She didn't have COVID, great. She had to stand sit in her car, stand in a queue in her car for 2 hours to slowly snake through the testing center until someone could stick a terrible thing up her nose and make her feel really uncomfortable. Would you really want to do that for the generosity of the community if you had a lot of other things to do that day and you had only the faintest sore throat? And you're like, I don't actually think that this is very much, okay? So can you see how someone would justify to themselves that maybe not today, and maybe they have COVID, okay? But the way the process is working now with our capability is discouraging some people from doing the right thing. Would you stay at home with a faint tickle in your throat and forego your only casual shift for the week? Okay, so do I go to work tonight? I don't think I've got anything much. If I don't go, I won't have money to buy food. Okay, so this is where the government is coming in, but maybe technological innovation can help people do some work from home in a way that hasn't been done yet, or, you know, or contribute remotely to the world so that they don't need to get out and put other people at risk right at this point in time. Would you wear a mask down the street when you have a 5G tower on your building? Okay. And this to me speaks of, and there are people who believe this. Why would I wear a mask? I'm not going to catch it from other people. I will catch it from the phone tower. Why is that? Well, because our current ecosystem hasn't been efficient enough at stamping out misinformation, which is still running quite wild in certain sectors of the community. And so isn't that a worthwhile technical effort that's not going to cure COVID, but it might, you know, help more people get to the right education, right information, and then make the right choices. Okay. So, you know, it's an interesting technological exercise because it's only successful if you can understand what humans need. So it's a very human-centered exercise. And I think that that is very, very cool about this idea of the hackathon, about the pandemic. So I think that the below two areas, so you've got some physical innovation, physical technology, so devices, objects, and information innovation, so apps, data handling, data science type of stuff, are new communication techniques and things like that. They are all very worthwhile and easy, I suppose, areas for people to dwell in. Okay, and so I wanted to invite, I know we are running a little bit late, but I wanted to invite, if you have sort of any sort of inspired ideas from some of the things that I've been mentioning, to say, you know, oh, you know what, from what I've heard, I might like to, you know, consider that, or I might like to consider this other thing, or I had this other thing in mind. You know, just throw a few things out there, and you know, they might help you assemble as teams or sub teams to do some cool things in your workshops.
I have a couple of questions and a couple of
Fire
ideas. I'll ask a question first. So in your previous slide, you mentioned human-centered design principles as the Venn diagram with desirability, feasibility, and viability. Why is human-centered design, you can have that intersection between desirability and feasibility, but without viability?
I understand. So I think I picked this one. There were a couple of versions on the internet. I picked this one specifically for this talk for a reason. It's very good that you picked it up. So usually when you learn about these things, the intersection is in the center, no more, no less. The situation that we are here, though, is that we are facing a global challenge. And this might actually push, I suppose, some actors. Okay, so viability is not feasibility. Viability usually is someone willing to pay for this? Okay, so in a situation where you have a pandemic, okay, you can actually be in a situation where you might be able to push a line that if this can be done, and if this is what is best for the people, a way to make it happen must be found, okay? Which is a bit of a different proposition that you have in a normal, if you like, business environment. So you could have more charitable actors, I suppose, that could involve themselves in this process that you wouldn't normally find in a traditional innovation ecosystem. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense. Thank you.
Did you have any comments after your questions?
Yes, if we go back to the brainstorming slides, wouldn't some people choose, I feel like with human behavior, I feel like there's always a part of it is just like human pride or spite tends to come in. So for example, it's just like, for example, let's take your wife's example for sitting in the queue for 2 hours. Would you, I guess it's like you have that fallacy. It's just like, okay, I've already committed an hour. I might as well be here.
Oh, of
It's
course.
like,
And
oh,
that's
it's like you
exactly
have,
what happened to my wife, I think.
yeah, it's just like, I think it's a sunk cost fallacy. So it's just like, oh, I already committed 2 hours, I might as well keep going. It's like, or would you go, I committed 5 minutes, I might as well keep going. I feel like that varies in terms of behavior.
Of
But,
course, of course.
I
But the
think,
counterfactual is if you had a test that everyone can do in 5 minutes, then you would have a lot more people showing up, you know, and
That's
you
true.
would have better community coverage. And that is a result of maybe an innovation exercise of some sort. And in fact, I'll show you in the next slide, there are a bunch of cool things being attempted that go beyond the traditional ways of testing, that have maybe slightly less accuracy, but decent sensitivity. And so as a screening tool, they're probably quite good.
and I also just wonder, do people choose to not, I guess this is a question for the entire group. Do people choose not to do things because they don't like to admit that they're wrong? Or it's just like,
I'm sure.
because if you consider like, oh, if you believe that like 5G towers causes coronavirus, wouldn't the problem be not to convince people they're right, but to convince people to tell people to admit they're wrong? Because isn't that the harder part?
That is the harder part. But then again, people take social cues from others, and there is certainly a lot of effort. And, you know, this is not something you need to solve, but I was just giving you an example. I mean, there's a lot of effort that's going on at the moment to contrast actively misinformation around COVID. And, you know, the major social platforms are actively engaged in this because they are recognizing that although it's not really in their interest to reduce activity on their forums, at the same time, this is doing a disservice to society by amplifying these ridiculous ideas that are going around. And so, and there is a technological space to improve that. There's probably machine learning and AI to identify, you know, clusters of posts about some of these topics with keywords, and, you know, and if this stuff works, it then creates an ecosystem where those things have less rope, then people maybe are less likely to subscribe to those ideas. I'm not being the thought police, but, you know, as a society, we should try to uphold the best that we can offer and not these conspiracy things. And one of the disadvantages of social media has been that it has actually created a lot more pockets for these things to just exist and amplify themselves. COVID is just one possible outlet, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, I completely agree with you, Dr. Nicolo. So I think the entire objective of reducing misinformation is very right. And also the fact that all of us tend to take decisions based on the immediate people, how we interact with them. So we form our opinions based on the strength of our opinion is directly, I think, correlated to the person who I am interacting with. I'll believe what my mother or my family member says more than my neighbor, right? And so I think, so I was, during your presentation, I was thinking like, is there any communication channel where everybody actively takes part in, and a way for us to, as technologists, to gather the sentiment around it. So I was thinking about Twitter. Now, only a certain section of a society is on Twitter. Okay, not everybody is on Twitter, but most of the conversations happen in your daily communication channels like WhatsApp, or be it Telegram, or such communication apps, where the actual information lies, like what actual information, what opinions are being transferred or communicated between people. Because until and unless we can analyze that, we won't be able to tackle the spread of misinformation. Because if we try to tackle the spread of misinformation just by analyzing what people are talking on Twitter, then it may not be as effective to one part of the society, which is actually spreading the virus.
I completely agree. And I must say, look, I'm not an expert in this area, but I certainly know that there's a lot of work going on. And the beauty of this work is that it is bringing together computer scientists, psychologists,
Everyone
social
to get-
scientists, because actually until you get to the bottom of why is a person reluctant to say that they are wrong, or why does a person prefer to chat to someone who's a complete lunatic about conspiracies instead of listening to this multi-awarded scientist who's on television giving a beautiful presentation. These are some mysteries of the human mind that I don't understand, but you know, they exist in society, and as one organism, one network, we need to find a functional place for these people. Because I mean, the other risk is that they become disenfranchised, and so that legitimizes the fact the reason to be different. And here I'm really going out on a limb that is not my area of expertise, absolutely. But there's people that you can have conversations with about this, I'm sure, in ANU that would know a lot more than I do. Guys, just because I don't want to keep you for too long, I wanted to show you my take of pressing challenges. So these are things that are in the news this week as things that are being talked about the COVID needs. And so I thought, okay, I'll bring them to you. So I talked to you about PPE already, about the rapid fit testing potentially, user friendliness improvements and so forth. So I won't go back there. Another thing I'll mention is occupation specific solutions. So you would have heard the fact that abattoirs and other food processing centers are particular targets for clusters for some reason. This has happened in Australia, has happened in Italy, has happened in the United States. So it seems to be happening a little bit across different countries. And it's got to do with proximity and work practices of people. And I can't help thinking that maybe there is an alternative way to design either work practices or using sort of some type of computing or automation to enhance social distancing while maintaining productivity, or even redesign personal protective equipment so that this risk can drop. Because at the moment, those factories are running at reduced capacities because it's the only way they can operate without having spread of virus inside. The other big thing, as you probably heard, is protection of vulnerable segments of the population. So the elderly in particular, if they catch this, they are reasonably doomed. And there's been very, very high degree of mismanagement inside nursing homes. That aside, you know, I can't help wondering if there are, you know, new aids, new things that we can provide these elderly people to feel more connected or to be able to run their daily life activities inside their care homes with less of a need to, you know, have physical connection with too many people. I don't know, say a little robot that brings them their meal or something along, you know, just to throw something out there, you know, something that can reduce their exposure to too much contact. People with disabilities are also another one that's emerging right now. So I was reading yesterday, there's been 2 disability centers, like disability sort of homes where a bunch of people with disability live, that have where the infection has got into, and so there are issues there as well. And similarly, you know, these are high care environments. So if we can replace some of that care with automation, then we can take some staff members out from that close contact all the time. Then prompt detection, effective tracing, you know, rapid cheat testing. So I was reading this week about COVID sniffer dogs being trained, you know, but maybe there are other solutions that are technological in that space. Computer-assisted augmentation of contact tracing capabilities. So I read an article the other day about this tracing exercise they did in South Korea, where there was a cluster around some type of venue, and instead of doing people's family links, or they did that, but they also went by financial transactions. And anyway, through some type of computer system that tracked orders of financial transactions and so forth, they identified people who dwelled in that area, and they managed to catch chains of transmissions up to 4-layer deep from the original contagion, which is pretty much impossible to do with phone tracing. So unless you've been onto it the whole time. So you know, again, there might be ways to automate tracing that enhances the ability of human tracers, especially where in places like Melbourne, they're completely overwhelmed there might be things to help with there. Compliance with public health directions. So that's a big thing, and someone flagged it before, you know, these people who are flouting things. I know this was discussed at National Cabinet this week, that there's a problem with the fact that in Australia, you're not required to show identity documents. Okay, and so people are flying, say, from the ACT to Brisbane. They can't anymore, but up until last week, they had managed to sneak out of Victoria coming to the ACT, which didn't have a border closure with Victoria. And then from ACT, they took a flight to Queensland without telling anybody. Well, maybe they booked under a different name or whatnot. Because you don't have to check IDs, then that person managed to get to Queensland under false pretenses. Again, can technology, so airlines say that they can't check IDs because they don't have sufficient resources or it doesn't work with their workflows. Is there something that we can do to help border control between states at this point in time? You know, identify people and help find out people who are trying to cheat the system. Again, I don't know, but maybe that's a thing, and it's certainly a concern at the moment. And then long-term COVID. So a clinical mystery. It's unclear what's happening to these people, how many they are, what type of, what's happening to their health. And so one thing I was thinking of is, could these people, or many people with COVID, actually be directly empowered in recording their own COVID experience into some type of structured, you know, data collection exercise, appropriately anonymized, obviously to protect their privacy, but that can contribute to, you know, maybe a transnational body of knowledge where, you know, people are contributing their data, and so you can actually start then to analyze it and find patterns of occurrences and symptoms and whatnot across populations that don't belong to the same health district, for example. So these are some of the things that are being talked about right now, and I thought I'd list them all up for you. But there's probably a million others that I haven't thought of and that you will think about. So last few thoughts, the way forward. So COVID is a crisis and a disruption. And as such, it exposes the criticality of our systems at the body level, at the community level, at the society level, at the global level. A bunch of stuff is happening now because of COVID. People would have not even thought that it was possible a few months ago. And ultimately, if we fix these weaknesses with our bodies, with our societies and whatnot, COVID will actually be less able to take hold. And it's just a thing. We will fix that loop problem that we had. So, and the other thing, as I said, the scientific challenges of unprecedented complexity. This virus is mysterious, it mutates, it does all different things. But remember that as a society, it can be defeated even without knowing all the ins and outs of its biology. By enacting sort of positive social impact, we can make a substantial difference. And that's really the spirit of humanitarian engineering anyway. So my suggestion to you is focus on the most vulnerable sections of the human population and use a needs and value-based approach to your ingenious innovations that you are going to try and do. And always try to think that the winner ticket for this, which is a collective problem, is collective knowledge to promote collective action in the right way, not collective misaction or inaction. And with that, I'm done. So thank you for listening. Happy to chat to you for a bit longer or let you go to your workshop. Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you so much for the talk. Yeah, it was enlightening. It's like I had so many different ideas and now they all seem connected.
Oh, that's great. I'm very happy to hear.
I found that your talk, Nicolo, was very useful in a sense that, like, I know that my group were debating about what does technology mean in this sector, but then I found like your talk quite inspiring in a sense that we're not limited to like a small field of like, oh, apps on a phone.
It can be, but it doesn't have to be.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you so much.
That's all right. Well, I wish you well. I am away for the rest of the weekend and busy with teaching next week. But if you have any questions or any curiosities, you want to follow up on this in any way, or I don't know, want to tell me your great idea to have some a chat about it, send me an email and we can organize sort of a follow-up in some way or other. I'll keep in touch with the organizers to see if we need to organize something else later in the event. All right. I wish you all the best, and I hope you come up with ideas that make you enthusiastic as much as the people who might be receiving them.
Just one question quickly, sorry, Nicolo. If we have any questions relating to like biomedical functions, are you okay with us sending you an email?
Yeah, just as I said, just send me an email. If there's something I don't know, I will try to refer you on to someone who might.
Well, thank you. Appreciate that.
No problem.
Thanks for the talk.
Thank
No
you.
problem.
See
All right,
ya.
guys, I'll leave you to it. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.